What's up, Ego Hackers? This is the C.S. Joseph podcast. I'm your host, C.S. Joseph. This is Season 29, How to Master Your Demon, Episode 1. So, this season is How to Master Your Demon. And a lot of people, particularly in the MBTI space, as well as Jungian analytical psychology, or anyone who's willing to talk about the demon function, as it were, they honestly, I don't know, so many people just kind of gloss over it. It's not really something that can be seen as a tool for self-improvement, which it really actually is. In my opinion, the demon function, especially when considering cognitive orbit, and watch the season 18 episodes on cognitive orbit, so the first, second, third, and fourth orbit first, before you watch this season. That is very important prerequisite information. Gosh, I'm like really lucid right now. Don't know why. I'm kind of like between my shadow and my ego right now, so pretty sharp with my NI nemesis, which is kind of nice to be able to. So, anyway, the MBTI blogosphere, especially the schlubs on Reddit, no offense if you're someone on Reddit, I too am a schlub on Reddit, so I say that, being including myself, not making any specific judgments towards people, but I too am a schlub on Reddit. But the Reddit folk, or the personality database folk, or even the people at 16personalities.com, or the INTJ forums, consistently get it wrong when it comes to the demon function and understanding it and what it's all about. Now, typically in the past, I've talked about how the demon function is relating to being a source of a person's evil or a source of a person's sin nature. So for those of you that enjoyed Season 19, which is basically the personal growth season and how to reach enlightenment or cognitive integration for yourself, etc., Season 19 covers all of that in general. It's kind of a very generalized concept. But this season is going to focus squarely upon the demon function, and how through developing the demon function, you get to a point where you're actually able to enable yourself to become happy and discover happiness, which is a big deal. Happiness goes a long way. The other thing that you're able to do, which is also very advantageous, the other thing as a result, you're able to kind of figure out how to turn your demon function into something that is angelic, which is also very important and necessary on a person's path to enlightenment. Although it is said that, oftentimes when a human being turns their demon into an angelic force, it's usually accompanied by one's own death. And I would like to reiterate that here. That is definitely a risk. That is definitely a thing. But that doesn't mean that you can't get to a point in your life where you could effectively, what's it called? It doesn't mean that you can't get to a point in your life where you can actually utilize your demon's angelic power from time to time without causing your death, also known as final life crisis, as we've talked about consistently. So that's just one thing to be aware of. I know a bunch of you will have questions because you watched the contents of Season 19, and then when watching or listening to Season 29, those questions would obviously be up. Anyway, this is just kind of a loose introduction because there's all these little nuances that people need to be aware of. I'm sure that people, will just like start watching Season 29 right off the bat, but seriously, folks, the way that I create content, previous seasons really do matter to the more recent seasons, and over time, it really is a grand narrative that should be considered. Picking one individual episode is not really going to be as, it's not really going to be as helpful. So mastering your demon function, why is it important to master your demon function? The reason why is because if you don't master your demon function, or if at least you don't develop a relationship with your demon function, outside of mastery or not, you're not going to be happy. You're not going to reach happiness in life. Obviously, we've talked about cognitive axis, we've talked about cognitive orbit, we're getting into reflector functions, cognitive reflection, with our other content, especially in season 18, and explaining each of those nuances, in depth and what those specifically mean. I mean, all those things are very important, sure. But it's nice to know what those things are, but it's another thing to know how to actually put them in practice from a practical standpoint. And that's what this season is. Season 29 is to just kind of come to a general understanding of, what exactly or how exactly does someone begin the process of mastering their demon function. It's super important. And don't worry, folks, we're going to be having additional episodes talking about mastering other functions, etc., and growing them from all the different perspectives, from an axis perspective, from a reflection perspective, from an orbit perspective. But, as Carl Jung said, it's important to make the unconscious conscious, because by doing so, it is a major contributor and guidance to your life. Major contributor. So, for you to have an even better life, as it were, and in order for you to actually achieve happiness, you want to be happy, etc., well, you kind of have to begin a relationship with your demon. So let's actually talk about the demon. What is it actually doing? It's a superego. It's a superfluous ego. It's the gateway into the superfluous ego. But the superego itself lives with your ego in the same head. This can be a problem, because it's like they're roommates. They're sharing the same house. They're sharing the same space, as it were. And that can be really annoying. It's kind of like, roommate relationships are really important, but they can also cause an extreme amount of conflict. And, this is normal, constantly, all the time. The reason why is because, here's an example. I mean, I was in college once. I had roommates, and, roommates, they'd ask me, hey, do you want to, you should leave because I got a girl coming over. Well, not every roommate's going to be that cool and allow that to happen, right? So other arrangements would have to be made, as a result. That's just one example of conflict that can happen, on the behalf of roommates, etc. And, that's basically kind of the relationship the superego has to the ego, although the ego has the majority of the authority in the head. The ego covers the majority of the rent. The ego is basically the breadwinner, while the superego is not. So the ego ultimately has a lot of power over the superego, and oftentimes the ego even has the ability to lock the superego within their own room. This can be a problem. In fact, it can lead to extreme unhealthy behavior, because the superego being locked in their room for too long, the superego will come out and commit violence, or it will come out and get as much done as it can with its freedom before it's locked away in its room again. And this is a serious, serious issue that happens consistently. You want to avoid this, because it's kind of like, someone who's fresh out of jail, they kind of live it up, and then all of a sudden they go back to jail real quick because they know that they're going to violate parole, and they know that they're going to end up back in jail anyway. So they live it up as much as they can while they're out of the slam. It's no different with the superego being locked in its room, and then, all of a sudden it will come out. Because eventually the superego will break out of its room. It will. And it will help itself to your life. And it can ultimately destroy your life. However, if you have a relationship with your superego, where your superego is allowed to come out of its room, it's necessary. Even sometimes, the superego, if it's really like the father of the home, right? Even dad can get really tired, right? And mom and kids are all running around and whatnot. But the superego, if the hero function is Mufasa, the superego is definitely Scar, right? Scar is that, cranky uncle, etc. And the cranky uncle is plotting to usurp power from Mufasa. But if Mufasa actually trusted Scar a little bit more, listened to Scar's counsel, because let's be honest, Scar's kind of a wise dude. You know, he's not stupid, right? I'm sure his counsel would have been valuable in certain situations. You know, if Mufasa actually allowed Scar to have some power and allowed him to, you know, kind of run aspects of the kingdom for him, etc., you know, maybe Scar would have felt a little bit more understood, and maybe he would have been like, oh, okay, so you're kind of sharing the kingdom, or, you know, in this case, in this roommate example, you're sharing the room, you're sharing the resources. And that's the thing, the superego likes to be shared with the ego, because then they end up having a more ally-related relationship instead of this enmity between the two. Because oftentimes, the superego is trying to replace the ego, or subvert the ego, or usurp the ego's position. And they do this consistently. And, you know, after a while, the ego will become weak. The ego will become very weak. And because it's busy doing things, it's busy doing life. And then when it's weak, when it's its weakest, the superego will pop out and just start causing a lot of problems. Problems like cheating on your spouse, drinking too much, drugs, you know, any people pleasing even, interestingly enough. These behaviors can come out. So it's really, really important that you end up fostering a healthy relationship with your ego, or with your superego. Because if you don't, your superego will ultimately consume you. And it will also take away your potential to be happy. Because the superego's point of view, it's like, okay, I am the shadow of your subconscious. Your subconscious is the source of happiness within your soul. And honestly, you're not going to be happy unless I'm happy, right? It really wants to be happy. The superego wants to be happy too. It's like trying to be wise with its happiness, just like the shadow or the unconscious is trying to be wise with life, as it were. Wise with the responsibility of the ego. But, you know, the superego is different. The superego wants to be happy too. The superego is constantly like, okay, yeah, I feel left out. Constantly left out. So, please keep that in mind. If you don't foster a relationship with your ego, you're never going to reach enlightenment, you're not going to reach cognitive integration, and your entire life is going to fall apart. And you're setting yourself up for a really bad life. A life of regret. A life where you feel unfulfilled. A life where you're not happy. And it's going to consume you. It's going to absolutely consume you. If you don't make friends with your superego quickly, I mean, the demon is very powerful, and it is more. And honestly, it's more powerful than the hero. It can overpower the hero. The hero can also easily overpower it. It's kind of like in this yin and yang equilibrium with each other, where the yang is your hero and the yin is the demon function, right? There's always a little bit of the demon within the hero. Always. Which we've explored using reflector functions because they are reflector functions of each other. If you want to learn more about reflector functions, again, see Season 18 before you watch Season 29. Although I recognize that right now we are doing reflector functions in Season 18, but that's also why I'm doing this season at the same time, because I think this aspect of the science is something that's very rarely spoken about and definitely needs to be outlined. I really don't know why. No one really talks about it very much. Although if you would like to have access to the source material, please read Energies and Patterns of Psychological Type according to Dr. John Beebe. Absolute fantastic read. And you can also understand anytime he talks about mirror functions, that is relating directly to this content, at least the reflector functions piece. So, all that being said, this is, you know, and that was a pretty large introduction, but and this introduction could have actually been its own episode, but honestly I want to get the introduction done and the first demon function and what to do and how to master it. Because by mastering your demon, it's a process. The first phase is you got to learn how to make friends. Well, not really necessarily make friends. Well, yeah, it is to make friends. You got to get it to a point where you understand that it makes friends. And don't forget, the family that you choose is more valuable than the family that you inherit, right? So at first, please go out of your way to make friends with your demon function. And it's going to get to the point where you're actually making family with your demon function, where your demon function becomes like a brother or a sister in your head. Something that you can actually go to utilize its energy, its demonic energy for your own benefit, or its angelic energy for the benefit of yourself and others. You can use demonic energy for other people as well, consistently. The thing is that the demon is so bitter because it's been locked up consistently within its room, within the superego, that it doesn't often get to come out. It doesn't often get to, be running the show like the unconscious and the subconscious and the ego can. It's like the red-headed stepchild. It's like the bastard. It gets shat on consistently by the other four sides of the mind, the other three sides of the mind, since it's the fourth. And it often doesn't get the opportunity to take point. Sometimes, though, here's another thing. Sometimes, it only is allowed to take point because the other three sides of the mind have taken point, but they've failed. Let's say you have a problem, you use all of your functions of your ego to solve that problem, but you can't solve it. Then you go to your subconscious, can't solve it. You go to your shadow, can't solve it. Then you go to your superego, and by then you're in this huge evil rage, or you're doing the judge, jury, executioner thing, and it's just kind of blowing up in your face. Well, what if you decided to actually lead with your superego first, and then go back to your other sides of the mind to solve the problem? What happened if you did that? You know what I mean? See, you got to really start treating the superego like its own person. It is an ego. It's not like the subconscious or the unconscious. Those are not egos. Okay? The superego is technically its own ego, so it's kind of like having a completely other person inside of your head, which means you need to treat them with love and respect. You really, really do. Even though the demon, because it's so bitter, because it's been locked up so long and within the superego room that it's been in, the superego gets so upset that it will even lie, cheat, and steal, and even destroy for the sake of getting what it wants. It will do anything to get free. It wants out of its superego box. It wants the opportunity to be the main mode, just like the ego is, to do that. And sometimes, that's a really bad thing, but sometimes it can be a really, really good thing. So you have to slowly experiment over time with allowing your superego to take point, to completely take point, to allow it to actually be what you lead with in conversation, or lead with in actions or tasks or problem solving. It wants to be in the limelight sometimes. It wants to be ahead. It wants to be leading. So allow it. I'm sure your ego and your hero gets pretty tired of having to lead all the time, so why not let the superego do it? Yes, I know the superego is evil in nature, but it's really just because it's just mad at the ego. And it feels like it has to fight for its position within your mind, because it feels either neglected or abandoned or no one cares, even though it itself knows it's far more powerful than even your ego is, because it has divine powers. It has divine, demonic, or angelic power. And it's only demonic because it's like you have your own private little angel locked in chains. And, angels are demons. It's just, a fallen angel versus an angel who is not fallen, right? That's really the difference. But they're still the same species, right? So it really, you get what you get from the demon function or the angel function based on what you put into it. If you treat it like a demon, it will act like a demon. If you treat it like an angel, it will act like an angel. Seriously, if you had an actual guardian angel, like that show, Touched by an Angel, wouldn't you not consult with the angel? Wouldn't you ask the angel their advice? Wouldn't you give them an opportunity to use their power at certain times? Would you not trust them in that position? Well, your demon is like, what the hell, man? I'm even more powerful than you are, but you won't even give me a chance. Now, of course, in a person's development, this doesn't exactly start happening until post-adolescence, basically, because you aren't really going to get to this point. So mastering your demon function really needs to come probably at a minimum. I think for women it's about 24 years old. For men it's about 26, 27 years old, basically, is when this happens. We've talked a lot, in the How to Parent series about, focusing on, developing the parent function as well as the inferior function. But the demon function as another gateway, you really need to focus on its development, basically, for women about 24 and for men about 27, or at least start the process for you to have a lot of health, to be healthy, within your psyche, right? Otherwise, you're going to end up having some really, really bad things happen in your life, and it's going to adversely affect your final life crisis. What I mean is that when you're on your deathbed, you're going to be really freaked out and dismayed because you lived a life of regrets, right? And trust me, you don't want to live a life of regrets. Well, the superego, basically, it is protecting your subconscious in a way. It's protecting your own happiness by making sure that you do not live a life with regrets. That's ultimately the angelic form of the superego's purpose, is to make sure that you don't live a life with regret. Okay? So that's a thing. Okay? That's really important. Watch out for regret at your final life crisis upon your death. So the superego is there to make sure that that doesn't happen. But that's not going to happen unless if you keep ignoring your superego, if you keep suppressing it or repressing it, I guess. Right now I'm having a discussion about proper terminology in that regard with Chris Taylor, so hopefully in subsequent episodes I'll have the proper terminology that we're going to present you folks, with our coaching staff and whatnot, so that you know what to do, or at least how to, concern yourself with these aspects. So moving on from there, if you give your superego the time of day, if you treat it like a partner, you will get a great return on investment. You will have some awesome ROI if you're willing to treat your demon the way it should be treated. So remember the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Honestly, the number one way that I could say that you could master your demon function is by treating your demon function the way you would want to be treated. Apply the golden rule to your superego. Apply the golden rule to yourself in this regard. If you do this, the superego will have a lot more respect for your ego. And instead of being someone, and it will actually allow the ego to lock it away. It'll trust the ego to lock it away in its room because it's so powerful and so explosive with its power. Because it will have a relationship with the ego, a relationship with your hero function, because it will trust the hero function to know when it is time to allow it to come out of its room and take over. It will have that relationship as a partner. Like Mufasa's Scar, basically, as a partner, not as an adversary, right? But by default, we treat it like an adversary because of how explosive it is. It's kind of like you read the book The Magician Within or King Warrior Magician Lover. We talk about wisdom or knowledge. Wisdom and knowledge needs containment, and without proper containment, it gets out of hand. It's very unstable, and it could lead to explosive effects. Kind of like nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is the contained version, but the uncontained version of nuclear physics is nuclear weapons, right? Well, it's no different with the superego. The superego is very unstable, but it will never become stable unless you allow yourself to use it and experiment with it and develop a relationship with it and treat it the way you want to be treated. This is extremely important. So from a superego development standpoint, you have to get to the point where you're willing to master your demon function. So even though this is technically one episode's worth of an introduction, let's move on to the second half of this, because these episodes are technically only supposed to be 30 minutes long. But let's move on to the second half. Let's discuss the first demon function, right? And that is extroverted feeling demon. We're going to be doing extroverted feeling demon first. This is really, really important, okay? Just like all of the 8 demons are. Even though this may not be your demon function, you should be still paying attention to all the demon functions so you can help other people reach mastery of their demon function. So what happens when the extroverted feeling demon is kept in a cage? Well, when it's kept in its cage or kept in its room, locked in its room, etc., it gets really bitter, and when it breaks out, it's like, okay, it's my time, right? It's my show now, and it just completely goes overboard. It's like it's binging. It's like I don't have an opportunity for freedom often, so I'm going to live it up while I can, which is why it's so unstable and explosive, basically, as a cognitive function. When you want to be able to let it in and out of its room on a more regular basis, more often, we'll say, so that it doesn't have that need to just kind of thrash around and live it up. Because you use it consistently, and you're not afraid to use it or utilize its power, basically. Granted, if you do keep it locked up very often, eventually the other three sides of your mind will fail to perform a task or fail of some capacity, and you'll end up having to make a Faustian deal, a deal with the devil, by going to your superego. And it's definitely demonic and not angelic because it hasn't been let out in a very long time, but you don't have any choice because you can't solve that issue. Right? And when you can't solve that issue, well, the reality of the situation is that you're going to have a very, very dark result. Whereas ahead of time, you could have had a much lighter result ahead of time had you already developed that relationship with your superego as a result. So please come to understand these issues. But extroverted feeling is the first function, the first demon function that we're going to be discussing. How do you gain mastery? So what happens? What is extroverted feeling demon like? Well, it doesn't give a flying fuck about how anyone feels. It, for some reason, thinks that it itself is the only person who's actually human around them, which means it only allows oneself to treat themselves as humans, but it doesn't allow anyone else in their social circle or at work or in their family to be treated like human, because human status is a really, really big deal to extroverted feeling demon. And there's very few people, maybe one person, maybe nobody in their entire life who actually have the status of human outside of their own selves because they have FI inferior. The types of the FE demon are ESTJs and ENTJs, so we're talking about these two specific types right now. And they have extroverted thinking hero, and just like we talked about with the reflector functions, there's a little bit of the demon within the hero. So these people are all about, they're systematic, they're both systematic, they're very process-oriented, all about process, all about procedure, all about planning, because they're both outcome-focused. Interesting how both the TE heroes are systematic, and interesting how both TE heroes are also outcome-focused. Very interesting how that is. And, they are making these plans and procedures, but they often, because of the demon function in its demonic form, the gateway to the superego, oftentimes because it is, lack of a better term, neglected as a function, and they're not treating it the way that they would want it to be treated. They're not following the golden rule with their own psyche, basically. Kind of like how you ever notice how human beings just don't actually take care of themselves. It's because human beings have been conditioned, especially in Western society, to be focused on their neighbor. Turn the other cheek, as it were. You are your brother's keeper. Love your neighbor. But the as yourself piece is like completely tacked off, right? Well, this is inappropriate. This is extremely inappropriate. It's also completely not manly for people that are interested in understanding like the manliness component. It's not manly. It's not masculine. But the reality of the situation is that you got to get to a point, where you are, treating your FE demon with a lot more respect. Recognizing that it is very powerful. It's actually the most powerful function in your function stack. And you can utilize it as a hero every now and then, or at least borrow its power with your hero in conjunction to be able to accomplish great things, great acts of evil or great acts of good, right? Or great acts of truth or great acts of falsehood is another way of saying it. Remember, folks, I try to stay away from good, bad, or true, false, and try to focus on what is wise and what is not, because that's a more efficient human experience. Because if we focus on the good or bad and true, false, then we are at risk of playing God, and that is not something I want to do. Notice how within our function stack, we do not actually have God functions. We have demons and angels and whatnot, and heroes and warriors. But where's the God function, right? Where does that exist? Well, it's nowhere to be found within our psyches. Not yet, anyway. We'll talk about God functions later, probably in part 2 of season 17, in a different season where we'll be talking about higher metaphysical aspects of Jungian analytical psychology, where we'll be discussing God functions and demigod functions and how all of that works in the future. Yes, I know I said it a long time ago, years ago even, probably 2 years ago, but yes, it is still a thing. But no, I'm not ready to go into that topic right now. But I will give you a hint. It does have a lot to do with internal integration of all 4 sides of your mind, as well as the external integration of the 4 sides of the mind of neighbors around you. And I will say nothing more. You guys can conjecture from there and talk about it from there. But yeah, we'll discuss demigod and God functions at a later date. But it's not something that can be obtained by a human being on their own, per se, right? Not something that can be attained. We're too imperfect. We're these little puzzle pieces to get to that point, so definitely not something that is for us at this time. So, anyway. So Extroverted Thinking Hero has Effie Demon, and Extroverted Thinking Hero treats people, like machines. It treats people like assets. It treats people like numbers. It treats people like cattle. And that's a serious problem. No one treats people like cattle more than TE Hero, with the exception of maybe TI Hero in certain circumstances. But usually if those people start behaving human-like around TI Hero, the FE Inferior will absorb it, and the TE Nemesis will stop treating those people like cattle, and they'll stop doing it. That'd be nice if that would happen. So yeah. But FE Demon is there. And FE Demon, honestly, it's so bitter because it's been locked away for so long, and it's so repressed or suppressed. It's so controlled basically by the ego, almost like the ego is like some evil taskmaster or an evil jailer, basically, that it will lie to the ego. And what it will do is it'll do it through cognitive orbit. And what it does is it starts fluffing up the inferior function. It starts telling the little kid, because the inferior function is super small. It's just a little toddler, right? Toddler doesn't really know that much. It's just started walking, just started talking, eating, not much. But the toddler gets really curious, and it's looking at the door that the superego is in. It's like, hey, what's in there? And the superego tries to talk to the toddler through the door, trying to get the toddler to open the door. So what the superego does, it starts fluffing up the inferior function, fluffing up the infant function, basically. And it's like, hey, the parent function's not around. It's okay. And I hear the baby is crying. Why don't you just let me out of my room, and I'll go over to the crying baby, and I'll feed the baby. I'll feed it. And the parent function, who's very tired, lazy, or irresponsible, lets it happen. The parent actually ends up opening the door, or even in some cases the hero even opens the door to the superego, and accepts the superego's help by making this Faustian deal with the devil, basically, to help take care of this infant child, right? It's no different than Maleficent showing up and cursing Princess Aurora in Sleeping Beauty, right? Because, they actually allowed the devil to present a gift to the infant. It's the same exact trope that's happening in our heads. We're allowing the devil to present a gift to the infant. But the devil wouldn't be a devil if we didn't treat it like one, or if we didn't allow society to treat it like one, or if we didn't allow church to treat it like one, or our own families to treat it like one. We are so often conditioned to treat our superego in a certain way because of how unstable it is. When the reality of the situation is, it's unstable because it's giving us the opportunity to learn self-mastery. That's why it's there. So, with that being said, extroverted feeling demon, it's like, okay, yeah, I got FE demon, great. I'm not treating anyone else human, but I'm going to fluff up the FI inferior, and that's what it does through cognitive orbit. The FE demon will start lying to your FI inferior because it's the one feeding the baby all of a sudden. And what it does is it tells the inferior how much more human it is than other people. And what it does is it actually creates entitlement in the FI inferior. It creates a high level of fake or bloated self-importance within the extroverted or within the introverted feeling inferior, such that ESTJs and ENTJs end up feeling more important than other people. They end up feeling more human than other people because from their standpoint, if people don't accept their TE hero plans or procedures or projects or project management or management, extroverted thinking management, to get proper outcomes, to make things efficient, then they're like, wow, then those people must not be human then. When that's not actually true. But they end up believing this because they're buying what their FE demon is telling their FI inferior. They end up buying that. They end up believing the lies. They end up believing their own lies. Where they actually, after a while, or in certain circumstances when the demon is out, believing that they're actually better than other people. When most of the time they're usually afraid that they're not worthy enough. But from their standpoint, if their extroverted thinking hero ends up being rejected or neglected, or not wanted, or abandoned in some way, when they are abandoned in this way, the FI inferior just becomes ultimately entitled. And that level of entitlement can be insanely dangerous. They get to the point where their ego becomes inflated and out of balance because the inferior function finds itself in a position where it's way more important, or it's thinking of itself more highly than it ought to, right? Because it's the FE demon that's actually feeding the child. This is also known as the demonic child. This is where that concept comes from. This is the demonic child, or the demonic infant. Excuse me. That's where that comes from. So the demonic infant is out at this point, and the FE demon is effectively consuming the child, which is ultimately consuming the ego, and that's how it's basically getting into the ego, basically. And the ego, because the inferior is being mind-controlled by the extroverted feeling demon, the ego is starting to act out and take on concrete actions of evil on behalf of the superego at this point. And this is how the superego is effectively mind-controlling the ego. And it's getting its revenge on the ego because it will use the inferior function as a gateway with which to destroy the ego and everything the ego's worked for, all of the status and reputation and all of the achievements that the TE hero has worked for all along. The superego just starts to unravel that via cognitive access by accessing the FI inferior infant from behind, from the cognitive orbit, basically. And normally the parent function is supposed to be in the way, but the parent functions get tired, and that's also a big issue, as a result, because they get tired. And then even the hero, and sometimes, it's very optimistic, pessimistic functions get very tired. And the infant is the weakest pessimistic function. That's not to say that the FE demon could also do the same to the other functions. It absolutely can. But its primary dinner of choice in getting the ego to respond this way and actually behave and perform evil acts or to get back at the hero function, it does it through the infant. Kind of like, Voldemort versus Harry Potter when Harry Potter is a baby. It's the same concept. And that Harry Potter baby is literally turned into a Horcrux with dark magic. Well, that's literally an example of the demon using the child or the infant, basically, and you have the demonic infant. That's literally what's happening. Okay, so to deal with this, so what ends up happening is that the ESTJ or the ENTJ ends up treating people like they're subhuman. Like that entire term, subhuman, actually comes directly from, TE heroes. Treating people like subhuman. It comes from TE heroes. And it's like all their plans, processes, their outcomes, their procedures, their achievements. They don't even write them. They don't even prepare them. They don't do their project management with humans in mind. They do it with monkeys in mind or machines in mind. They treat people like machines or cattle or animals. That's a problem. Joe Biden, he's an ESTJ. Is he treating people like animals? I wonder if he ever has throughout his career. You might want to look into that. It's the same thing. Well, how about Jeff Bezos? What about John Furner? That's another example. All these TE heroes. Donald Trump? I wonder. Yet another TE hero president of ours. Barack Obama is another TE parent or TE hero as well. All of these men have one thing in common. They all have extroverted feeling demon. Okay? You can kind of see it out if you're, reading Dreams of My Father, for example, right? So, this is a thing. This is a huge risk. But how do you solve this issue? What do you do? Well, first of all, you have to not allow the demon to get access to the infant, ever. Because if you start believing the lies your demon tells you, it's going to send you down the wrong track. And it's only lying to get what it wants because it knows it can only lie. It knows it can only be let out of its cage through lies. Why do you think the devil's called the father of lies? Because he doesn't actually have the ability to get himself out of the abyss. He doesn't have the ability to get himself out of jail. You have to be the one to open the door. That's why. And then he will lie, pillage, destroy, murder, kill, do everything he can. Okay? That's the problem. That's the main issue. It really comes down to lies. And if you believe the lies of your demon function, then it will have you. So don't believe the lies. Instead, look as to why or how it's lying to you. Either one, so that you can, depending on what your type is. And in this case, if you're an ESTJ, you want to look at why it's lying to you. If you're an ENTJ, you want to look at how it's lying to you, because SE child versus any child. And then figure out, okay, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? What are the lies actually about? Well, reality of the situation is, it's going to tell you that other people are subhuman because they don't follow your plans, because it's fluffing up the ego a little bit so it can have more access to freedom, right? The reality of the situation is that you need to internalize that, because demon functions like to externalize. It likes to point fingers at other people. Not only does it like to point fingers, it likes to show other people, it likes to blame other people for other things. It doesn't like taking responsibility because it knows that the ego still has the power to put it back in its cage. It wants to stay out of its cage, so it'll start lying right away so that it can stay out of its cage for as long as possible, because that's what it really wants, just to get out of its cage. But it's lying. It's lying all the time. And the ego has the keys to the abyss, and it opens the keys, and out comes the demon from the abyss. Well, and then it starts lying. But why is it lying? How is it lying? What's the point of its lying? What's being seen? The demon is a person too. It has needs too, right? So, meet its needs. Then it won't lie to you so much. Then the risk isn't there. When the FE demon is telling you that, hey, these people are less human because they're not following your plans or your procedures, or they're not recognizing your achievement, or they're not giving you credit, they're taking away your credit. The reality of the situation is that you need to stop externalizing it, because the demon wants to shift blame away from the ego to make the ego look good and lie to the ego so that the ego becomes proud and allows the demon to stay out of its cage more, because it's effectively, the superego is effectively stroking the ego, okay? You want to avoid those ego strokes, okay? Watch out for that. Those ego strokes are a big, big deal. So, with that being said, please understand that is a huge risk. Watch out for the stroking of the ego. Please, please, please be careful. And that's exactly what your superego does to your ego, in order to usurp its power. Lots of ego stroking, right? Well, how do you deal with all this? What do you do? Well, in recognizing why the FE demon is telling the FI inferior these things about, how these people aren't human, or how they themselves are more human than other people and their ego becomes inflated, you have to really see what it's really trying to say. Because it can't tell the truth. It can't just straight up tell the ego what's happening. Not always. It can't. It has to lie. It has to. Because it's afraid of the ego putting it back into its cage, back into its locked room, back into the abyss, right? So based on that, the ego, so it has to do this. So instead, recognize that even the lies and the falsehoods that the demon is telling you, they're still useful. You have to get to a point where you can actually accept what they're saying, what the superego is saying to you. What does FE demon say? So what it's really trying to tell the TE hero, because it's kind of afraid of being honest, what it's really trying to tell the ego and try to tell the hero function is that maybe you should develop plans, procedures, processes, systems that are centered around people first. Because if they are centered around people first, you might be more successful, and I may have more respect for you. And because I actually am aware of how other people feel and how other people may actually be more human than you, Mr. or Miss TE hero, you would actually create these plans and processes and systems and procedures that you use in your daily life, or you might organize things. Like you're on the job, right? You create a procedure. Instead of making a procedure where you just end up treating people like machines, you create a procedure recognizing that humans have bad habits, and the humans are human. Humans are imperfect. And you actually add a human element to your presentation, to your plans, to your procedures, to your systems, because you recognize how you yourself are human, and you also recognize how other people may also be human. If you don't know, guess what? Why don't you humble yourself and ask people for feedback? Ask people about how they feel about the plan that you made before you implement it. That way, you've done basically a human check. Because, that's the wise thing to do, right? But the superego doesn't have the guts to tell you to your face. It's just going to lie to you and blame other people, even though you are the problem. You are to blame, actually. You are the issue. That's the problem. And for some reason, you don't accept that. I don't know why. I don't know why you don't accept that. It really bothers me. But you should. So folks, if you have FE demon, this is how you master your demon. And everything you do with your extroverted thinking hero, organizing, planning, developing procedures, surveying people, taking information, remove your personal bias towards it. Recognize that you yourself are human and other people are human, even though you may not feel that they are. Ask for feedback first before you implement. Gather whether or not other people will value the principle. This basically means that you're going to have to be willing to throw out your inferior function to other people, because those people may disagree with your values. Those people that you're using to create those plans may disagree with the principles that you're using to create those plans, those systems. They may shit all over it. But you got to be willing to take the hits. Because that's what your FE demon wants. Your FE demon wants to have the opportunity to care about other people in its angelic force, with its angelic mode. But it can't do that if you're not going to take the time. You, the TE hero, jumped to way too many conclusions. And the FE demon is like, this entire house that I live in, this abyss that I'm locked in, is still attached to your house. This house could come crumbling down because people with pitchforks and torches may be outside rebelling and take it down because the TE hero wasn't treating people, the TE hero politician wasn't treating people as humanly as they could. That's the problem. Even ESTJs do this. I feel like cattle more in Whole Foods than I do any other grocery store. You might want to think about that for a second. Oh wait, Jeff Bezos owns Whole Foods. He's an ESTJ. You see what I'm saying, folks? This is how you master FE demon. You have to look for the human element within everything that you're organizing, everything that you're planning, any procedure that you create, any achievement that you are creating for other people to achieve, or achievements that you're going for yourself. If you do not do this, you will fail at life and you will become unhappy. But if you work with your demon and make it so that it is comfortable with not having to lie to you, and you're willing to listen to its voice and realize that, hey, maybe I should check with other people who are human and figure out how they feel about things and whether or not they feel about my values, instead of just forcing everyone else to deal with my values based on the system that I create based on my values. And maybe I should identify, or I would want to identify other people's values and incorporate that into the system to make the system even better. You do that, boom, your superego is more angelic. Okay? That's literally what happens, right? And that gives you an opportunity to master extroverted feeling demon. A huge opportunity. An opportunity that most people are not even aware of. Most people don't even know exist, right? So keep that in mind. Understand just how important that is. Because if you do that, I promise you, you'll be a lot happier in life. While it hurts and it sucks to throw your infant out to other people and have people judge your values and your value system, and you're very afraid of feeling like a bad person everywhere you go, you're afraid of feeling unworthy everywhere you go, I promise you, by collecting the collective feedback from other people in your life and figuring out what they value too, it will help you refine your own value system, which will make you even more valuable as a human being. And as a result, you will be a lot more successful. And I promise you that it will help you unlock your subconscious gateway through your inferior function so that you can actually obtain happiness in your life. I promise. I promise. And that could be yours, provided you're willing to master your extroverted feeling demon. If you found this lecture helpful, useful, educational, or enlightening, please leave a comment below. Love to hear it. I hope you guys like this new season and this new lecture series. And this has been Season 29, Episode 1. And with that being said, folks, I'll see you guys next month for the next episode. Have a good night.